the echo of the mountains. The blizzard didn't just fall over the Appalachian hills. It hunted. It was a relentless, sideways-driven wall of ice that swallowed the winding asphalt of the highway until the world was reduced to a singular, uncertain shade of gray. Nestled on a sharp bend outside of Pine Hollow sat a lonely diner, its amber windows glowing like a low fire against the encroaching dark. Inside, the air was heavy with the familiar scent of scorched coffee, hot grease, and the hum of quiet conversations that had lasted for generations. Caleb Rohr sat in his usual corner booth, his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. At 35, Caleb carried himself with the quiet, economical grace of a man who had spent a decade in the Navy SEALs. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight, and his eyes, the color of weathered steel, constantly measured the exits and the shadows. He didn't fidget. He didn't waste motion. Beside him, tucked beneath the table, lay Briggs. The German Shepherd was 8 years old, his muzzle dusted with gray, his body still powerful but resting with the calculated stillness of a veteran. Once a working K9, Briggs knew the difference between a threat and a distraction. The diner's bell clanged, a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the low chatter. The room went silent in that specific way it always does when someone who doesn't belong walks through the door. A young woman stood in the entrance, shivering so violently her teeth rattled. She looked to be in her mid-20s, though hardship had etched weary lines around her eyes. Her jacket was far too thin for a mountain winter, soaked through at the shoulders where the snow had begun to melt. Her hair, a deep, damp brown, hung loose around a face that spoke of long miles and even longer nights. Her name was Mara, though no one in the diner cared to ask. She moved tentatively toward the booths, her eyes pleading for a place to sit, to thaw, to simply exist. But one by one, the locals looked away. Spoons paused mid-air, conversations died, and a wall of silent exclusion was built around her. In these hills, comfort sat very close to its absence, and a stranger reminded people of how quickly they could lose everything. She reached Caleb's booth just as her strength finally gave out. Her knees buckled, not with drama, but with the quiet surrender of a body that had been asked for too much. Caleb was on his feet before she hit the floor. He caught her under the arms, guiding her down with practiced, gentle hands. "Easy," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I've got you." Sarah, the waitress who had worked those floors for 20 years, moved in quickly with a mug of hot chocolate and a bowl of thick stew. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't ask her name or where she had come from. He simply wrapped his heavy jacket around her trembling shoulders and waited. Outside, the wind hammered against the glass, an angry beast trying to find a way in. "It's getting worse," Caleb noted, watching the whiteout swallow the parking lot. "You can't be out in this." Mara looked up, her pride flickering even through her exhaustion. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. Caleb looked at Briggs. The dog had stood up and pressed his warm shoulder against Mara's knee, a silent gesture of acceptance. For Caleb, that was all the confirmation he needed. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he decided. The drive to Clearwater Ridge was a battle against the elements. Caleb steered his truck through the white abyss, his hands steady on the wheel while Mara sat in the passenger seat, clutching her soup. The cabin emerged from the trees like a dark timber fortress. Inside, it smelled of pine, old books, and the clean scent of wood smoke. For 3 days, the storm held them captive. Caleb established a routine of work for stay. He didn't want her to feel like a charity case, so he gave her tasks: stacking firewood near the hearth, mending old gear, and helping with the animals in the barn. Mara worked with a silent, fierce efficiency. She was a daughter of the hills. She knew how to stretch a meal and how to respect the silence of the woods. Briggs became her constant shadow. He didn't scan the room aggressively anymore. He simply sat by her feet, sensing that she was the one who needed guarding now. Caleb watched her from the kitchen, unsettled by the way her presence filled the house. The walls seemed to hold sound longer. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. On the third evening, the discovery happened. Caleb was in the barn, and Mara was tending to the laundry in the narrow back room. As she lifted a heavy pair of Caleb's work pants, a thick leather strap fell from the pocket and struck the floor with a hollow thud. It was a handmade tourniquet, the leather darkened by years of use, sweat, and oil. Mara knelt to pick it up, but as her fingers brushed the hide, she froze. She turned the strap over in the dim light of the laundry room. On the inside, where the leather met the skin, 3 parallel lines had been carved by a steady hand. Beside them was a crooked, slightly off-balance letter C, the unmistakable mark of a craftsman who had been in a hurry but took pride in his work. Her breath hitched. She traced the second hole in the strap, which wasn't factory-punched but jagged, made by a nail and a hammer. She knew that mark. She had watched it being made when she was a child, sitting on a stool in a dusty workshop while her father cursed a cheap buckle that wouldn't fit right. Caleb walked into the room, his boots clumping on the hardwood. He stopped when he saw Mara sitting on her heels, clutching the strap to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was thin, brittle, and dangerously close to breaking. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, his face shadowed. 15 years ago, he began, his voice dropping into a register of painful memory. I was a young soldier on a winter deployment. My unit took fire on a frozen ridgeline. I went down hard, shrapnel in the leg. I was bleeding out, and the cold was finishing what the metal started. Out of nowhere, a man appeared, a mountain man. He didn't ask who I was or what I was fighting for. He just took off his belt, tied it around my leg to stop the bleeding, and dragged me 2 miles through a blizzard to a pickup point. He saved my life, Mara. I never even learned his name. Mara looked up at him, her eyes brimming with hot, angry tears. His name was Thomas Caldwell, she said, her voice shaking. And that act of kindness was the reason my family lost everything. Caleb felt the air leave the room. The debt he had carried for a decade and a half suddenly had a face, and it was the woman shivering in his guest room. The harvest of justice. The silence that followed Mara's revelation was heavier than the snow outside. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of 15 years of survival suddenly pressing down on his chest like a physical burden. He had always known he owed his life to a stranger, but he had never imagined that the price of his breath had been the systematic destruction of a good man's legacy. They called him a traitor, Mara whispered, her fingers tracing the C on the leather. In these hills, folks don't like it when you bring the government or the military to their doorsteps. After that night, the work dried up. People stopped looking him in the eye. He had to leave us, Caleb. He went to find work in a city 3 states away just to pay the taxes, and he never came back. A scaffold collapse took him before he could say goodbye. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't offer empty apologies. He knew that for a woman like Mara, words were hollow unless backed by the weight of action. I can't change the past, Mara, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But I can sure as hell fix the present. The next morning, the war room was established. Caleb reached out to the only people he trusted to handle a fight that didn't involve bullets. Evelyn Hart, a land use attorney with a mind like a razor, and Noah Pike, an investigator who could find a ghost in a vacuum. For weeks, the cabin was filled with the smell of old paper and the hum of a printer. Evelyn tracked the chain of title on the Caldwell property, finding a jagged history of transfers that didn't line up. Here, she said, pointing to a document from 6 years ago. Your mother's signature was notarized on a day she was documented as being in the ICU, heavily sedated. This isn't just a mistake, Mara. This is a theft. Noah Pike focused on the cousins who had seized the land. He built a timeline of their movements, finding a pattern of predatory behavior. But they needed one more piece of evidence, the original deed or a record of Thomas Caldwell's intent. The breakthrough came near dusk on a Tuesday. They had returned to the old Caldwell homestead, a weathered house with sagging porches and windows that looked like hollow eyes. Caleb let Briggs off his lead. The dog didn't run, he worked. He circled a collapsed tool shed near the back of the property, his nose low to the frozen earth. He began to dig, a rhythmic, frantic scratching against the frost. Under a warped floorboard, buried in a rusted metal lockbox. They found it. Inside were Thomas's original journals and a set of unrecorded documents. He had known the cousins were circling. He had written down their threats. And tucked at the very bottom was a photograph of a young Mara, with a note on the back. For my daughter. This land is her heartbeat. Don't let them silence it. The legal battle
What a
that
beautiful
followed was
morning,
not
isn't
fought
it?
with grand speeches,
Yeah, perfect day for a
but
new
with
start.
the cold, hard clarity of truth. In a courtroom in the county seat, Evelyn Hart laid out the evidence. She showed the hospital records, the forged signatures, and the journals Briggs had found. When Caleb took the stand, he didn't talk about the law. He held up the leather strap, the tourniquet that had saved his life, and told the story of a man who gave everything for a stranger. The judge's gavel sounded like a thunderclap in the small room. The fraudulent transfers were voided. The land was returned. The Caldwell name was restored to the registry of Pine Hollow, not as a memory, but as a living legacy. Spring arrived in the Appalachians with a stubborn grace. The snow pulled back from the fence posts, and the mud softened under the sun. Mara unlocked the front door of her father's house for the first time in years. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and lost time. But as she opened the windows, the scent of pine and damp earth rushed in to greet her. Caleb didn't leave. He traded his tactical gear for a hammer and a saw. Together, they rebuilt the porch. They cleared the overgrown orchards. And in the barn, they created something new. A community center where the elders could teach the younger generation the old ways, and where no family would ever be left to face a storm alone. The community changed, too. Neighbors who had once looked away now arrived with baskets of food and offers of help. The truth, once spoken aloud, had a way of shaming the shadows into disappearing. The wedding was held in the meadow where the apple trees were just beginning to bloom. It was a simple affair, filled with the music of fiddles and the laughter of people who had forgotten how to be afraid. Mara wore a dress of white lace, and Caleb wore his best jacket, his steel-gray eyes finally holding a look of peace. Briggs sat regally at their side, a bandana tied around his neck, his tail thumping against the grass. After the ceremony, they walked to the edge of the property, near the stone wall where the woods began. Caleb knelt and placed the leather strap into a small, handcrafted wooden box they had built into the foundation of the house. I spent 15 years wondering why I survived that night, Caleb said, taking Mara's hand. Now I know. I wasn't just saved to keep living. I was saved to bring you home. Mara leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out over the ridges that had once seemed so cold and indifferent. My father used to say that regret makes a mess of good deeds, she whispered. He'd be happy to know his deed finally finished its work. The story of the soldier and the girl from the hills became a legend in Pine Hollow, a reminder that miracles don't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Often, they come in the form of a seat offered in a diner, a dog who knows where to dig, and the quiet courage of those who refuse to look away from the truth. As the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long golden shadows across the valley, the three of them, man, woman, and dog, walked back toward the house. The storm was over, and for the first time in 15 years, the silence of the mountains was a beautiful thing.